It's my privilege to introduce Jessica Garfield-Kabbara. I remember first meeting Jess about 6 years ago when I was studying PCC and I came into Rick's class. And I was just in receiving mode, download, and then Rick was like, okay, I'm gonna have, Chad and Jess take it from here and teach a class. And I looked over and I was like, Jess is a teacher? It's like, she looks like a student and a really young freshman one at that. But
it's my baby face.
Soon did I learn that you would internalize this knowledge academically and experientially. And it's been a reminder that you're probably, you're not actually a PCC student or alum, but you're the most PCC non-PCC person around. And often not the most PC either. Yeah, and then I remember 6 years ago to the day at Esalen, and I innocently came in after a night of bath, tubbing, and just there innocently to get my toast, and Jess was sitting there with the eyes half open, and when Jess is one of her modes, one of her moods, when things are just coming through, and I was like a little, fly landing in the spider's web. 2 hours later, I didn't even know what had happened, but my chart had come out and all of a sudden deconstructed, and it was my baptism into archetypal astrology. And it was actually a really powerful moment because I felt like I learned the language and words to put to my experience. Things, especially around Saturn, I was just starting my Saturn return, and I was experiencing and feeling things really intensely and really acutely, and it was like a whole new language, a whole new vocabulary to understand and relate and participate with my life. And it was such a gift. And Jess, I've always felt you're just such a pillar of this community, a pillar of archetypal astrology, teaching it, sharing it, and embodying it. And there's been talk about attunement and about just feeling into the space, and I feel like you're really great at that, seeing and feeling what's underneath, what's under the surface, what's not being spoken, what's not being expressed. And something I really admire about you is your commitment to truth and your commitment to speaking your truth, and how difficult that can be sometimes. And that's something I've absorbed, and I think a lot of people have, and it's something I'm grateful for. And there's something about your own learning journey, and when you're learning and growing, you're sharing that with everyone else around you. So what you're learning and growing is like shared. It's kind of a circle like that. So it's been a pleasure for me to be alongside you, and going down to Pacifica at the same time. You were helpful for me figuring out that part of my journey, and feels like we've kind of been interweaving and intersecting and sharing, occasionally colliding and bumping into each other, but recovering and continuing. So I look forward to many more years of that, and it's been a real pleasure and a real privilege, and looking forward to what you have to share. So without another moment, let's introduce Jessica Garfield-Kabbara.
Thanks, Jessie. Aw. Good morning. Oh, I'm so excited to be here with each one of you. It's always such an honor to share time and space. And as we begin, I want to get a sense for who's new to astrology. Okay, great. So today we're going to be focusing on the archetypal complex of Saturn and Neptune. And I'm going to show you an image right now of the world transits. The reason that I'm talking about this today is because we're entering into a 3-year time period collectively with the world transits of Saturn in the sky squaring Neptune. Dun dun dun, come back. So I'll use my cursor here. This is Saturn, and this red line is a square. It's a 90-degree angle to the planet Neptune, the trident down here. So before we dive into Saturn square Neptune, I want to put it in context of the larger archetypal wave or morphic field that we're all participating in right now, which many of you are aware of, and that's the Uranus square Pluto, also a 90-degree angle. What's important for us to remember about the Uranus square Pluto is that Pluto is the archetype of transformation and evolution through the death-rebirth process. It's destruction of the old in order to make room for the creation of the new. It's that kundalini energy, that driving force of evolution. It also relates to the underworld and everything that is repressed, that is taboo, forbidden. It relates to the darker sides of life, the mystery that's underlying the surface of things. And it's also the archetype of power. And in that square to Uranus, Uranus liberates and awakens whatever it touches. It emancipates it in radically new ways, novel ways. And so when you get these two archetypes together, they give us what we all know happened in the 1960s. From 1960 to 72, they were in a conjunction, meaning the same place in the sky. And this is the first time since then that they're in major alignment again. And we can think of all of the radical transformation that happened. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights. And this archetype, this archetypal combination, correlates to the return of the repressed. So when we are looking at the Saturn-Neptune archetypal complex today, we need to remember that because it's a Uranus square Pluto time period, everything else that's happening during this time, every other field we're a part of, is going to be intensified, deepened to its extremes. So we're going to be having deeper experiences of hell and deeper experiences of heaven. The whole multivalent spectrum, the whole spectrum of possibility is going to be enhanced and intensified during this time. So it's really important for us to remember that the relationship between planets are like all relationships. It's a two-way street. They're mutually inflecting and interpenetrating. Like a healthy relationship, there's give and take, reciprocity, and exchange of energy. So when the archetypes, through us, are in a healthy, balanced relationship, there's a mutuality, a co-arising, where both archetypes are honored simultaneously. They're integrated. But like unhealthy relationships, which we all are a part of as well, they can become imbalanced and toxic. And that's when we collapse and over-identify with one side or the other. We identify with one and we reject the other. So today we're going to explore how both of these ways of Saturn and Neptune being integrated can come through and how them being separated can come through. And it's also important for us to remember that every archetypal complex that we talk about is always situated within our historical context. The archetypes are evolving, just like we are. As our consciousness evolves, the archetypes evolve. We're in a living participation with them. Not only are we knowing ourselves through them, they're knowing themselves through us. So let's begin with Neptune. Neptune is the planetary archetype that corresponds to the wellspring of the imagination. It's the source of all metaphor, image, fantasy, story. It's the stream and flow of consciousness. It's the unified field. It's the principle that seeks unity, undifferentiated experience, communion. It also, in its shadow form, corresponds to escapism and addiction. Like Chris mentioned last night, a kind of falser sense of unification, a temporary sense of being able to be connected. A numbing out, self-deception, something we all participate in, deceiving ourselves and deceiving others. These are some of the shadow sides of Neptune. It also relates to timelessness and the transcendent, the transpersonal, the numinous, the sacred, enchantment. It's our spiritual aspirations. It makes us more sensitive to everything. It relates to empathy and compassion, a universal sense of being connected to one another. It also relates to that first perinatal matrix that Stan Grof talks about, from conception to the first contraction, up until the first contraction. That's the first stage of birth, that intrauterine experience where we are undifferentiated from our mother. We don't have a personal sense of I or me-ness yet. We don't have self-reflective consciousness yet because we're not experiencing ourselves as autonomous and separate. So it's us also in that memory, that primal memory we all carry of heaven, paradise, Eden. And so now we go into Saturn, the archetype of Saturn. And Saturn, I think, deserves our deepest reverence and respect, for we live in its realm. This is the realm of Saturn, of time, of space, of materiality and form. It's your skeletal systems, it's your bones, it's your flesh. It's a sense of limit and boundaries and finitude that gives us the possibility for containment, a sense of individuality, a sense of being able to perceive as being separate from things around us so that we can be an observer and therefore enter into relationship and have the potential, the possibility to co-create. This is what Saturn gives us. It's the principle of incarnation, that moment that we become separate from our mother. And so we enter this world through Saturn, the second stage of birth, that moment of the first contraction that expels us from the womb, from the Garden of Eden, from paradise or heaven. That's Saturn. We have to die as aquatic beings in order to become air-breathing mammals. Therefore, it is the guardian of the threshold. It is the one that we have to pass through time and time again in order to have an experience of the archetypal pantheon, which is contained within Neptune. So in order to be able to experience Neptune, the spirit, the mystical, the numinous, we have to have Saturn. It is embodiment. They chose each other a long time ago to be in this relationship. And it's a deep process of love that they're in. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. So, a lot of us are familiar with how Saturn can usually get kind of a negative rap to it, right? In the tradition, it's a malefic. It's a negative planet, usually something to be feared. And there's a lot of good reason for that. Up until the past centuries, it was the last planet that we knew existed. It was the last planet that we could see with the unaided eye. So it represented the edge of our known universe. There wasn't Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, the transpersonal planets. And so back then, when we lived in a much more fatalistic and deterministic cosmos, when we didn't live to be as old as we are now, we weren't as aware of the functions of the body and of how we could be in relationship with our surroundings in a way where we didn't die at a young age, Saturn was something to be feared. It's death, it's mortality, it's finitude, it's the ending of things. Well, when we live in a culture like we do now that sees death as the final endpoint, that we just come here one time and that's it, death is something to be feared. And of course it would be a malefic planet. If you're a one-timer, not only is death to be feared, but pain is to be avoided and anything negative. We live in a culture that is built around repressing pain. We do everything we can not to feel it. We're addicted to opiates, alcohol, marijuana, TV, you all know it. We're addicted to not feeling pain. And it's because we don't have that elongated sense of self, that eternal Neptunian core of who we really are, present to us in our everyday consciousness and in our culture. And so we see Saturn as something to be feared. We see pain, suffering, and death as something to avoid. And I think that for us to come into a healthy relationship with Saturn and Neptune, we have to change that. We have to bring in a reincarnationist perspective in our interpretation of Saturn. Our suffering, our pain that we go through as individuals and as a collective species right now absolutely does not make sense if we don't take into consideration that we have lived many lifetimes and we will continue to live many lifetimes. The other thing we have to do with Saturn is we have to bring the feminine principle back into it. We all hear Saturn as Father Time, Kronos, the strict patriarchal ruler that punishes you, coming out of the Judeo-Christian God that has become popularized. Saturn has a very feminine principle to it. It's matter, which comes from the Latin word mother. It's Sophia, wisdom. Wisdom that comes through the experience of suffering in space-time, through the experience of loss and separation, that which fortifies and strengthens our being. It gives us our sense of individuality, which I think each one of us treasures so much. So we have to remember that Saturn also is the Great Mother. And I believe that it's our ecological imperative to remember that, because if we don't recognize Saturn as sacred, we are going to continue to destroy the Earth, Gaia's body, and our own bodies. We deny our bodies, we deny the Earth. That's a denial of Saturn. It's a lack of reverence in seeing the sacred in Saturn. And so what we know is that Neptune brings healing and wholeness to whatever it touches. It makes it sacred. It's the spirit that ensouls the cosmos and animates it and gives breath to all things. So when Neptune is squaring Saturn like it is now over the next 3 years, it's an opportunity for each one of us as individuals to begin to align ourselves in the great task of re-ensouling matter, of making Saturn sacred again by bringing healing and wholeness to it through some of the things I just mentioned, understanding the reincarnation perspective, and also feminizing it. So this is an opportunity and an invitation to re-intuit and reimagine the archetype of Saturn. If the archetypes are evolving just like we are, our participation in them during these collective world transits or your own personal transits actually shapes the morphic field of that archetypal combination in a new way. It imprints a new memory into that archetype. Sometimes in this community, I hear us wanting to find new archetypes. We want to discover the new planets and the new archetypes. And I think that's great, and they're probably out there, and we have a lot more to learn about the asteroids. But I think part of what we're longing and yearning for is actually metabolizing the archetypes as they are right now through our collective consciousness and bringing in deeper new instantiations of what the possibilities of the archetypes that already exist, how they could be embodied in our present world. So Saturn also correlates to the principle of patriarchy. And the reason that is that it represents the establishment and the status quo. It's the principle of tradition, the past, where we come from, the structures and systems in our life that give us our civilization, our society, our culture. And so because we've been living in thousands of years of patriarchy, Saturn corresponds to patriarchy. So we have to become really curious about the ways in which we view all of the archetypes through a patriarchal lens. And this was kind of what I was relating to about Saturn being, related to the father time, right? It has a very kind of harsh quality to it that's very fear-based. If we begin to reimagine Saturn in its feminine forms as Sophia, wisdom, the goddess, mother, that gives us incarnation, that gives us the opportunity to experience Neptune and the rest of the archetypal pantheon, then we can begin to actually shift how that archetype is experienced not in our own lives, but everybody else's life. So Saturn is also affecting Neptune. I said Neptune is bringing healing and wholeness to whatever it touches. It spiritualizes it. The other way is Saturn contains. It matures, it grounds, it refines, it incarnates whatever it touches. So this next 3 years is an opportunity to mature our spiritual visions, to ground our Neptunian ideals of the transcendent reality and bring it into embodied form, to make it real, to concretize it, to give it shape, to bring it through our bodies in the birth process. And we all know that that's a lot of hard work, and it requires a lot of energy and effort on our parts. Birth is messy. Consciousness is traumatic. To have self-reflective consciousness is traumatic. And I really love what Chris Bache actually writes about in Dark Night, Early Dawn, which was helpful for me in understanding this process of why the Saturn-Neptune dialectic is both part of our core nature as a human being, right? It's Saturn, it represents our individuality, and Neptune represents our sense of wholeness and interconnectedness, right? Both of these things are happening at once. But the essence of the pain of the Saturn-Neptune archetypal complex, which we will all experience and have experienced and will continue to experience for quite some time, is that Chris talks about how when our history, Saturn, encounters our true nature, our essence, Neptune, our transcendent core, that is an inherently painful process because of the comparison of where we have come from and the decisions that we have made and more of our narrowed, fragmented consciousness in space-time meets the part of us that is eternal, that is transcendent. That is the mirror. That is the moment of self meeting self, and that's a painful moment. We all experience that. The shame in that moment of not living up to our highest potential. But when we feminize Saturn and we bring in the reincarnation perspective, what can happen is that moment is actually an act of love. It's an opportunity for us to bring more of our transcendent nature into form. It's a moment where we can hug ourselves and love ourselves and say, thank you for this opportunity for me to remember who I really am and where I really come from. It is an act of grace. And that's the cosmic love affair that's happening between these two principles inside each one of us in every moment. That moment where we become transparent to ourselves. And this is the biggest shift I think that we will be making. And that is that pain and suffering is not a punishment. You didn't do anything wrong. You're not bad. You didn't make some mistake that can never be healed or redeemed. Pain is a process of purification. It's an opportunity to get back in alignment with who we are at our most core sense of self. We can look at that moment in Genesis where the apple is taken, not as a sin that we forever have to redeem, but as the opportunity to come into consciousness and have the experience of individuality and exploration to create and give birth to whole new worlds with and through the divine. So the fundamental way that we can honor the Saturn-Neptune dialectic is by the awakenings and openings and visions that we have, whether in our dreams at night, through the encounter of a new author or a new teacher, through prayer, meditation, your psychedelic journeys, is that labor of love, of bringing that vision into embodied form, into Saturn's realm, as the bridge and the mediator between the ideal of Neptune and the real of Saturn, that Rick so beautifully talks about in his articles of the ideal and the real, Saturn and Neptune. They're both fantastic articles to read. And they talk about people in our culture and our history who grapple with this, who have the Saturn-Neptune. It's each one of our tasks, but if you're born with it, it's even more of an archetypal signature in your life. So it's about integrated transcendent experiences. Recognizing that pain is our greatest ally, that Saturn is our greatest ally, and it deserves our reverence and respect. So to go in a little bit more to how this complex can show up in our lives, right? As either integrated or separated, which are both functions of Saturn. The integrative principle and the principle of negation and separation. All right, so we have matter and spirit, immanence and transcendence, the finite and the temporal with the infinite and the eternal. differentiation, and unity. These seemingly two separate ontological universes, these two different realms of being. So if these two realms, if we think of that right now in our current context, we can integrate them and get things like incarnating the divine and incarnating more of our souls through the suffering and doing our inner work, right? That's what happens when we do our inner work through psychotherapy, through psychedelic work. We're incarnating more of our souls. More of us are present. You can feel it. When someone's done their work, you're like, you're more here. You're more tangible. I see more of you. Hello. It's a spiritual devotion to a higher sense of meaning and purpose. It's selfless, senseless. It's selfless service, right? You see it a lot in the healing professions with doctors and nurses, where they live a life of healing other people. You also get it in the devotion to the interior life of the artist, right? Saturn is devotion, it's commitment, it's seeing things through. It's knowing that the difference between a tragedy and a comedy is that the comedy just has a fifth act. It's seeing it that one step further, seeing it through one more time. So there can be a sense of resolve or completeness in that level of it, that level that it's operating in. But we also know that incarnating is a messy process. The birth process is a messy process. And so in its more challenging forms, the Saturn-Neptune archetypal complex can relate to things like despair, a sense of hopelessness, feeling alienated and disconnected from the divine, any sense of meaning or purpose, feeling completely isolated and alone in your experience. It's the experience of, pessimism and cynicism, depression, existential angst and anxiety, not being able to connect to yourself and other people. Usually shame is involved in that, right? Shame is the fear of disconnection, and when we're afraid that we're going to become disconnected because we already feel a sense of worthless or inadequacy, we tend to do things to perpetuate that cycle and create more disconnection. It's kind of the hell experience, right? Hell is being completely cut off and alone. Saturn-Neptune has the very real felt experience of being in absolute hell, being completely cut off and alone. A desolate imagination and an inability to envision. I know people who have Saturn-Neptune that can't pray because they don't think they're worthy of asking God for help. I know people who have Saturn-Neptune that isolate themselves and suffer with lots of addiction. They, again, feel that they're not worthy of connection and belonging. It's an opportunity to unmask illusions and naive deceptions. It's an opportunity to see through projections. It's the eye for shadow, seeing through the illusion to what's actually there. So, there's a lot more I could say about that, but I want to leave some room for questions. And I just want to finish by saying two things, and that is that I believe that astrology is one beautiful integration of the Saturn-Neptune archetypal complex. It provides an opportunity to facilitate our relationship with the divine, both within and without. What is astrology, right? It's tracking the gods and goddesses, or the archetypal energies, through empirically looking at the movement of planets, right? So the planets are Saturn. It's the material, physical form. And the energies, the archetypes, are Neptune. And we see the two coming together in a conjunctio, right? A sacred marriage. We see that our psyches are reflected in the movement of the planets. This is something that Chad and I would talk about a lot. Talk about the archetypal mirror. And it's this opportunity to really see yourself in a deep, deep way. But in a nice way, too, because it's a little objective. You get a bit of a distance from it. When you're looking at your transits in your chart, you can see the shadow side of, let's say, the Sun-Pluto archetypal combination, and you know that it's the shadow side, irrespective if you had it or not. And so it allows you to start to come into relationship with your shadow in a way that's has a little more space in it than, let's say, psychotherapy or psychedelic session, where you're just in it, you're immersed in it. There's not that sense of a little bit of distance. So it helps facilitate our relationships and coming in deeper communion with ourselves and the cosmos. And I guess the one last thing I want to say is that I think that the task or the role of humans right now in this cosmic love affair of Saturn and Neptune is finding ways for us to begin to align with spirit and matter coming back together in their reunion. It's a love affair that transcends each one of our individual existences and is going to happen irrespective of whether we help it or not. So we can align ourselves in this teleological unfolding that the cosmos is going through and become the vessels of embodiment, of incarnating the divine through how we live moment to moment, and most importantly in our relationships to one another. Or we can remain unconscious and it will happen anyways, and maybe it will happen with our species, and maybe it will happen with the next instantiation of our species. Either way, we get to be a part of the cosmic drama. Thank you. Do I have time for questions? Okay. So I'd love to hear what you guys think, or if you have any questions, totally open. Yeah. Do I need a, oh.
I don't want to take time saying thank you, but thank you. I have a question about something I'm struggling with. Sure. Around pain and suffering. Yeah. In this context. I could feel into and resonate with everything you were saying, mm-hmm. and it's something I feel like I want to live into. I struggle with, and I got the struggle with Marion Woodman reading her. Pain as a process of purification and suffering. How to integrate that and honor that in a cosmological way, and then how to coincide that with oppression and people who have experienced a lot of suffering at the hands of oppression. I don't know if you have thought about that or have thoughts about that, but something I'm struggling with. So I'm wondering if you have anything to that.
Sure, I'll do my best. I have a couple thoughts. First of all, something really practical that each one of us can do, and I imagine a lot of us are doing, are grief practices. I have a grief practice where I've made a vow to myself that when grief arises, as soon as it arises, I do my best to make space and time for myself to feel those emotions, the sadness that comes through. I love crying. I love it really more than anything. It feels so cleansing to me. And I think that it's even the next level to be able to do that with somebody else present. And I think that's what we're doing in this community. We're trying to have that emerge here, to create the safety to be witnessed by someone else in our pain and our suffering. That seems to take it to the next level, because when you have two consciousnesses present and one of them is witnessing the other person's pain and suffering, it helps metabolize the pain and incarnate more of that person's experience, because it validates it, because that witness is hopefully being empathetic and loving. And so you're essentially letting yourself know that what you're going through is okay. And normalizing our experiences removes the terror from it and the sense of being inadequate. So something that's problematic about our culture is, because we avoid pain, it's become very melodramatic. Like, it's compounded so much that we have to get through all these layers before we can even get to the core of what the actual pain is. So we have all these self-defense mechanisms that we do to keep us from actually feeling what the core of the pain is. So something that I think is very challenging about our times is we don't live in a culture that supports us feeling our pain and grieving. So when it comes to oppressed people, they're oppressed because the oppressors are trying to evacuate their shame and their pain, and they're aggressing upon the other person and trying to imprison them because they're really imprisoned themselves. So the number one way we communicate how we're feeling to someone else is by making them feel the very way that we're feeling. So one thing that I think we all need to begin to do is recognize that it's actually the oppressed people who are closest to the earth right now. And that's where we're trying to get back to, is closer to the earth. So they're actually the voices that see through the system in a way that the people who haven't been oppressed can't see, because they're unconsciously acting out in their blind spots to oppress those people. So it's actually the oppressed people that we need to make the most space and time for, to sit with and hear their pain. And I think until we do that, we're going to continue to be in this thought loop. That's also another definition of hell. We're in this thought loop, and it's getting really boring, and the tape's running out. So I think that's when kind of radical openings in the system begin to happen. And it's very volcanic, because the pressure, it's more dangerous to be near a volcano that never erupts than one that erupts slowly over time. That's why I like to cry on a weekly basis instead of saving it for that once a year moment. I'm not sure if that entirely answers your question, but those are some thoughts that initially come to mind. Yes.
Do you have anything to say about perhaps the cycle of Saturn returning to Neptune in the next 10 years, or what the whole cycle might be of moving into a square and then opposition and back to square and then returning?
Sure, I can say a little bit about that. So the Saturn-Neptune conjunction happens approximately every 35 to 37 years. And right now, we're at what's called the waning square. So when you think of the moon, the sun and the moon's relationship, the new moon is a conjunction, and then the first square is the waxing square, and then the opposition of the sun and the moon is what gives us a full moon. Well, we've passed the full moon mark that happened back in 2004 to 2008. The Saturn square Neptune.
Especially 05 to 07.
Or 05 to 07. So
extending into 04 to 08.
Yeah, so they were in an opposition then. So now we're in the waning part of that. And so the next phase will be the conjunction again. And I'll just say one thing that I really appreciate about Dane Rudhyar, an amazing astrologer from the 20th century, and that is he describes the qualities of each of the quadrature angles. And he describes this phase of the waning square of Saturn-Neptune as a crisis in consciousness, whereas the first square is a crisis in action. That's the Uranus square Pluto. That's the waxing square. We're in that. So a crisis in consciousness is more about integrating all of the lessons that we've learned from the whole cycle up until this point. So looking back at the previous cycles of the Saturn-Neptune, so the conjunction started in the late 80s. Of this cycle, and there's a new form of consciousness coming in there, because it's also the time period of Uranus conjunct Neptune. So I think a lot of the themes of this Saturn-Neptune square is about integrating all of the things that we really learned in the 90s and actually giving them form and incarnating them and sharing them with other people, all of the wisdom of that experiences that we went through then. It's about, did we learn the lessons from it? And if we haven't yet, how can we continue to actually have our lives reflect what was seeded in that conjunction in the late 80s? That's one way to look at it, but I'm also not a mundane astrologer, so I'm not very good at looking at the history and being able to let you know like exactly what happened in each period. But that's some of my sense of it. Are we done? We're kind of out of time.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to take one more.
Keep going.
I'd like to hear Rick's question.
Okay.
I partly just wanted to praise how articulate and spirited and inspirited your presentation was. It's just so, Dane Rudhyar was the first great astrologer to teach here at Esalen back in the 60s, and it's great to see an emerging great astrologer teaching here at Esalen in the 2010s, 20-teens. And your metaphor of the love affair between the romance between Saturn and Neptune reminds me of something that Joseph Campbell also said here at Esalen, where he said, Christ on the cross reflects eternity's zeal for time, which is exactly, Neptune for Saturn. And then just the only last, I just wanted to expand one important differentiation you're making. If you had more time, you probably would have said it, but I think it's important to just add it. And that is simply, when we think about the patriarchal side of Saturn and or the masculine side of Saturn and that connection of it with Father Time, or the punitive side of Yahweh in Genesis, etc. And that's all very clearly part of the Saturn archetype. And then you said how important it is for us to feminize Saturn and recognize its the things that we can love and in Saturn, etc. And I just want to expand that to hold the fact that there's also the positive masculine Saturn as well as the problematic feminine Saturn. They always have that balance, which I know you know. And so, for example, just think of that, like the father who is just that, as solid as an oak tree, supporting, or a masculine person or principle that supports that, gives solidity through every storm, whatever. That would be a very much Saturn and very, in this case, masculine. Or you think of that song Tradition from the Jewish musical Fiddler on the Roof, tradition, and just that celebration of what tradition held for the Jews, holding it together and keeping that kind of nourishing solidity, stability, depth of the past into the present through every suffering. So that's the and just the Saturn is also, as the feminine, is also the contracting great mother's uterus and the devouring mother and that which separates in order to give us birth. So it's a way of making sure that when we rectify that patriarchal one-sidedness, as you know, all those planets that have masculine names have an equally profound feminine side, and we have to do that, but we also have to keep nuanced and balanced in both the masculine and feminine sides of each of those archetypes, which I know you know all that, but just thought I'd fill it out.
Yeah, to honor always where we come from and to remember the birth pains and labor of what patriarchy has given us, and having gratitude for that and not becoming patriarchal about our new way of being in the world, which is this. Yeah, so it's good to remember to be inclusive and not to...
Yeah. Patriarchy is the 5,000-year birth canal of the great mother goddess.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.